This is a photo of Coffin Homes in Hong Kong meant for some of the poorest people in the most expensive city in the world. These homes, which are technically illegal, can be as small as 15 to 120 square foot. And statistically speaking, many of these homes are smaller than the average size casket.
Most would buy them when he sleeps.
One of the smaller places I've ever been inside. It actually seems like people are living at the top of the stairs and then on the rooftop here. There's the toilet and then the home. How many people live inside in this space?
9.
9. Wow.
It's basically a subdivided flat converted into lockers for living. They take a 400 square foot flat and they build out 18 wooden cubicles that resemble coffins, each around 15 square feet. And they're paying 1,300 Hong Kong dollars monthly, which is averagely around 169 American dollars.
Yeah, 3 neighbors right here, and then welcome to the walk-in closet.
Everyone's seen the video before, and to see it, it's smaller in real life than on the video.
So if you consume any form of cyberpunk media, you probably would have seen in the depiction of the future, like crowded apartments, just too many people for the space you're watching. And of course, even going back to the original Blade Runner, certain scenes on the streets of 2019 LA are just so overcrowded. But even in stuff like that, we often get a look into the homes of these people, and they're quite spacious to some degree. They have okay apartments. Even in 2049, you see Kay's apartment. I mean, nothing special, but I've definitely stayed in studio apartments that were smaller than that in my life. But when you see stuff like Coffin Homes, you think we've even gone beyond that point. Now, this comes at a really weird time. Like, Coffin Homes have been a thing for a while, but I hadn't heard that term used until I actually recently started reading Neuromancer by William Gibson, like seen as one of the main people who inspired the cyberpunk genre. And in this book, he talks about people's apartments being coffins, and it resembles very much the coffin homes you see in places like Hong Kong and Malaysia today. And I just wanted to contextualize this in, I guess, regards to capitalism around the world and why, you know, the capitalist class don't mind people sandwiching themselves into tiny spaces which are smaller than a prison cell, because with urbanisation as well in many places, it's just beneficial to the elite to have this supply of workers and also just keep them with essentially a gun to their head. That's what capitalism is, where they don't have any choice but to live in these terrible conditions or just face life on the street, owning nothing and being at the mercy of, I guess, society, police forces, and stuff like that. And one thing I want to touch on is, although a lot of people might make themselves feel better by looking at something in Hong Kong or Malaysia and thinking, well, that's Asia. Asia has loads of people. You know, China is one of the most populated countries in the entire world. Most of the most densely populated places in the world are in parts of Asia. Why should I, as a Westerner, have to worry about that? But don't worry, when there isn't regulations on what you can rent out, and there's increasing demand for people to move to a place, or housing is so unaffordable, you might just start taking the cheaper option. And as I'm probably going to show you, in New York, although they're not coffin-sized, there are these homes that are becoming increasingly popular, which are absolutely tiny. And it seems like because we're owned by the landlord class, I don't think things are going to improve. So expect tiny homes and coffin homes to actually not just be something relegated to parts of Asia. You're going to see them more in Western countries. So all of that coming up for you today. Please check out my social medias, my Instagram, nearly on 4,000 followers, so let's hit that. And also my travel Instagram, where funnily enough, I just posted a reel about my time in Cambodia, which felt like very cyberpunky, which surprised me a lot. But I enjoyed making that one, so go check that out. Also check out my Threads and Blue Sky, and if you want to support the channel, trying to build up as many $1 to $3 patrons as possible. Benefits include early access to videos like this, which you can watch ad-free on the Patreon page itself, and also access to the Discord server. With that out the way, let's get into the video. So I want to start this section by just talking about myself and talking about William Gibson as well in Neuromancer before we dive into the Hong Kong stuff. So I have lived in Southeast Asia. I lived there for 7 months, and I bounced between Vietnam, Cambodia, and Thailand. And I lived like a, pretty normal life there. It wasn't really like loads of tourism, doing the grocery shopping, living in the same place for like a month or so. And not in everywhere I stayed, but in Hanoi particularly, the population density where I was staying was quite high. And I actually rented an apartment from this Vietnamese woman, and it was on the top floor of like an old French tower block. Like, because of French colonization, if you go to Hanoi, you're going to see a lot of remnants of that. And I was really surprised at how many people they fit in this kind of tower block, and how much the original French architecture had been adapted with like sheet metal and stuff to extend the rooms outwards. And of course, if you've been to places like Southeast Asia, you see all the wires for connecting like phone lines and electricity, just all, a mess. It's just a mess. It's just such a fire hazard. And we were staying on the top floor. And it just gave me a good insight into what that actually looks like when people are really crammed on top of each other. Now, our apartment wasn't small by any means. It was pretty nice, a bit run down, but I can't complain like too much about it. And also what you appreciate more when you live in that environment is just the noise, being able to smell other people's like cooking, being able to hear basically everything, dogs barking, coming at like from every angle, because there's actually an apartment like everywhere you look on this top floor. But if I ever do that sort of thing again, I wouldn't stay in a place like this, because one night I was filming a YouTube video and our apartment just like had so much smoke in it. We hadn't been cooking or anything. My girlfriend runs up to me and she thinks there must be a fire downstairs. We're really worried at this point because there is no escape. We can't get out. There's no fire escape. If the fire is consuming floors below us, we're going to have to jump out the window probably. And we go out and we look down, 2 stories down. It's a guy burning fake money. And if you've been to parts of Asia, you know it's like a good luck thing, but it completely smoked out the whole apartment. Obviously very relieved, but then realizing that, we aren't safe here. And humans shouldn't live this close together just because of the safety. But then you think about things like COVID, for example, or just any sort of pandemic and how quickly that spreads. Humans should not live in that close proximity. And remember, I'm staying at a place where pretty much it seems people have enough showers, bathrooms. We had our own bathroom and shower. We saw like shared ones as well. And it wasn't too overcrowded in that sense. But when you take that to the next level of everyone is just living in a bed, sharing everything, and just living on top of each other, then that is, of course, ripe for disease. Talking about this a bit further, William Gibson actually called these apartments coffins in his 1984 book, Neuromancer, which I've been reading recently, really enjoying it. Didn't realize how much it inspired, like, The Matrix. Didn't realize how much it inspired, like, the Cyberpunk tabletop. Like, it's pretty much could just be a Cyberpunk book because it's so similar. The place in Japan he stays is even called Night City. But I just wanted to read apart from page 23, where the main character goes home. So Case had rented a coffin here on a weekly basis since he'd arrived in Chiba, but he'd never slept in a cheap hotel, which is the name of the place. He slept in cheaper places. The compound was roofed with cheap laminated matting that rattled in a strong wind and leaked when it rained. But the coffins, this is what he calls them, were reasonably difficult to open without a key. The coffins were 3 meters long, the oval hatches 1 meter wide, and just under 1.5 meters tall. Fluorescence flickered on as he crawled in, pulling the hatch shut behind him and slapping the panel that activated the manual latch. So again, the coffins were 3 meters long, the oval hatches 1 meter wide, and just under 1.5 meters tall. So for someone like myself, you couldn't stand up in it. And reading the book, it feels very, very claustrophobic. But even with that description, that seems like quite good compared to some of the things we're going to look at today. So we're going to be mainly focused on Hong Kong. And just to transition from what I've just read you to Hong Kong, the author of Neuromancer, among other things, he's still alive today, he's actually been inspired in part by Kowloon. Now, Kowloon, if you guys haven't ever seen it, was an absolute like giant, I don't know what you could really call it. It resembles kind of like a favela in Brazil, just like this city that just kept building and building upon itself. If you've played Call of Duty Black Ops, they have actually a really good level set in Kowloon, and it has been the inspiration for like a lot of things to do with Cyberpunk, including things in William Gibson's own work. But it feels like any positives of Kowloon in Hong Kong have completely gone out the window. And like I said, already people living on top of each other is not a good thing. It gets even worse when people essentially lose their humanity by having to live in these insanely cramped spaces. So I probably showed you at the start videos of a lot of this stuff, but I just want to really make it clear how small they are. So obviously you guys might have seen these pictures going viral where it's like essentially a coffin from Neuromancer, maybe a bit smaller. You have like TVs, fans, everyone's clothes, and you guess, you know, what you see there, people coming home and just trying to pass out. And what I actually thought while looking at all these pictures is, I bet the use of recreational drugs is super high in these coffin homes. And I want to talk about that a little bit later, because someone for The Guardian actually went and lived in one for a little bit, and he spoke to some people there, and, you know, surprise, surprise, of course, it's hard to cope and live in those conditions. And I watched some TikToks today. I'm not going to play this one because I think it might be copyrighted, but at the same time, I'm going to show you some pictures and just to really highlight how small these places are. So this one in the example, 2.5 feet width and 5.9 feet across. So for someone like me, 6'2", I can't even fit in this bed. And as you can see here, it's actually way smaller than a Hong Kong prison. You could fit multiple of these rooms in a Hong Kong prison cell. And the thing is, it's not even that cheap. The ones in these videos are going for $255 a month. So if you had like one other person to share with, in like many parts of Asia, you could get an okay apartment for like, let's say $500 a month, right? But that's the problem with Hong Kong's housing. $255 for a bed that wouldn't even fit most Western people overall, I think. I think 5'9" is like the average size of an American person and stuff. So many of you just couldn't fit in that. And would you even want to? But this has been a problem for a long time. You might have seen it like I have because of the virality of some of these clips. But My Week in Lucky House, The Horror of Hong Kong's Coffin Homes by Benjamin Huss for The Guardian. And it's just one of the places with coffin homes. So the residents of Lucky House in Hong Kong are anything but fortunate. They are some of the poorest people in the most expensive city in the world. In one of its 46 square meter apartments, 30 residents live in purpose-built plywood bunk beds, each with its own sliding door, colloquially known as coffins. 2 rows of bunks, 16 bunks in each row, still space for 2 more people. The residents are retirees, working poor, drug addicts, and people with mental illness, mostly those unable to keep pace with the spiraling cost of housing in Hong Kong. In many ways, their homes feel like a railroad sleeper car, but even more cramped and uncomfortable, and with none of the charm or romanticism that comes with train travel. For a week, I lived at Lucky House, crammed in a stuffy bunk teeming with bedbugs, and at night, my days spent lazing around with not much to do besides talk to other residents and stare at my mobile phone. And I like this part of the article just to really get yourself into what it must feel like to live in this. Imagine this being your reality every single day. When I entered my coffin for the first time, I immediately noticed the strong musty smell. I imagined the other residents in their bunks, each one roughly 60 centimeters wide and 170 centimeters long. So these are even shorter than the ones I showed you earlier, with only enough space to sit up. Living in such a confining space takes a mental toll, but my week pales in comparison to the other residents who've been living there for months, sometimes years. At night, I can hear everything happening around me, every punch, kick, and scream from my neighbor's kung fu movie, the smacking of lips eating barbecued meat with rice, a brief argument over who will use the soul shower next, and of course a symphony of snoring. The next morning, the sound of a plastic travel alarm clock first wakes me up at 5:30 a.m, but in my coffin there is no sense of time. It could be any hour of the day and no natural light would reach me. When I leave my coffin at around 7:30 a.m, one of my neighbours is already preparing the first dose of meth for the day. Hong Kong's coffin homes have a reputation for danger and filth, sheltering convicted criminals and drug abusers, and in my short time I saw roughly a quarter of the people regularly using drugs. So of course it's not surprising people who are like looked down upon by society or discarded by society would be found in these homes, and it's kind of like a self-perpetuating cycle, because if you are addicted to recreational drugs, you're going to go to one of these homes, and how are you even going to cope with that environment? Like, think about that. I told you about my own experience, which many of you wouldn't probably find pleasant on its surface, but then think about being confined to the coffin bed as well, on top of that. The article also talks about how this even became a thing. So it goes on to say, coffin homes started in the late 1950s and were occupied mainly by new immigrants from China as part of employer-provided housing. Originally, there were metal bunk beds that were then wrapped in a chicken wire type of fencing, and a few of the old-style caged homes still exist. Many pay for their coffins with roughly £180 a month government subsidy, but social benefits alone are not enough. The monthly rent for one bunk ranges from 1,800 Hong Kong dollars to as much as 2,500. My bottom bunk space cost $2,100 a month, although the top bunk was slightly cheaper. And Hong Kong has by far the most expensive housing market in the world. The average person would need to save more than 18 years of pre-tax salary, spending that money on nothing else in order to afford a home. Nearly 1 in 7 Hong Kongers live in poverty, according to the latest government report. The average wait for public housing is more than 4 years and 8 months. This is back in 2017, by the way, with more than 100,000 families vying for spots. So many blame the government and property tycoons for the current state of affairs. The Hong Kong government posted a £9.2 billion surplus last year and has fiscal reserves of about £85 billion. But despite the wealth, it remains one of the most unequal cities in the world, behind only New York, which we might talk about later, and the poorest 10% earn about £260 a month on average. So although Hong Kong is in a bit of a unique position, in that it's kind of like this place caught between the East and the West because of, so long under British rule, designing their system, designing their laws, but then being handed over back to the Chinese government, although it does still have, some autonomy as well. But it also just suffers from the exact same problems most, places that are desirable suffer from. So it said New York there is worse than Hong Kong, but New York is just so attractive to so much foreign money. In the UK at the moment, especially London, obviously where I'm from, there are so many empty fucking apartments because there's so much investment from the Gulf states, there's so much investment from China. Before the war in Ukraine, there was so much investment from Russian oligarchs, and London has been well known as the money laundering capital of the world. So a lot of these real estate projects are just done to launder money, but also they just remain empty because they're too expensive for most people to buy. And also it has the knock-on effect of just raising the prices everywhere in this country. And also you have the combination under capitalism of a lot of people who make the laws are also landlords themselves. So there are no laws against things like owning loads and loads of property. There are no rent controls in places like London. You can just jack up the rent however you want, basically. And I'm pretty sure that's probably the same in places like Hong Kong and New York, although there are often a lot of laws that do, in theory, say they cannot do certain thing. We all know the power lies with the landlords for the most part, and we all know a lot of tenants can't be bothered with the hassle of going to court and potentially being evicted or doing that while not having a place to stay. And most of the time when you're kicked out in this current economy, the next place you're going to stay in, if you want somewhere in a similar size, is going to be even more expensive than what you were paying for, even with the increased rent. So I'm not surprised Hong Kong is suffering from this problem. It just seems to be like a bleak combination of factors that have pushed so many people into things like coffin homes. Now, this article does have a lot of personal stories of different people who live in these coffin homes. I don't want to read all of them, so I'll link the article, but I do want to read one of them. So someone called the janitor. So one particularly hot afternoon, I escaped to the open air hallway just outside the door to the apartment. That's where I met the janitor, smoking a cigarette where he leans against the railing overlooking a grimy back alley. The janitor can barely remember a time before living in Lucky House. He managed to move out a few times. One job provided dormitory housing, but he was forced to return when he injured his leg and could no longer work. I'm injured and I have a lot of health problems, so I can't work anymore, but I'm too old anyway, he tells me. Along with exactly how long he has lived at Lucky House, the janitor can also cannot remember his precise age, saying that he's over 60. He walks with a cane now, and his smoking habit means he's unable to travel far from his oxygen concentrator, which sits just outside his coffin with a thin plastic tube snaking into a crack in the plywood door. He rarely has a need to travel far, his relatives are all dead, and he has no one to visit, but he attempts to keep himself busy closer to home. The janitor and I share a wall, a thin half-inch piece of plywood, painted mustard yellow that does little to block the sound of the films he watches on his DVD player, and his frequent coughing. So that is one sad story, which I'm sure you can find throughout Hong Kong, as I'm sure you can find stuff like that throughout the world in people who live in these terrible conditions, thanks to a system of economics that makes housing a commodity above all else, rather than a human right. So someone like this, who is sick and old, should be retired, should be in public housing, should be able to live the rest of his life with dignity. He's forced to sleep in a tiny bed, in cramped conditions, just basically like waiting to die. Is that what we want for the human race? We want this shit to happen so property tycoons can make even more money from just extorting people for rent. Thing is, with Coffin Homes, it's an extreme thing, of course, but we can all relate to those problems, or we can all relate to knowing someone like this janitor person. We all know how much the economic system puts a strain on us to make enough money just to live, right? Just to have a basic housing, basic food, basic essentials like water and electricity. And again, there are people who defend this system despite the fact that only like 1% benefit from it, where the rest of us all have to just destroy ourselves for capital to varying extents. And you could be one of the probably billions of people who have a life similar to this. And when you have people living on top of each other like this, of course, like with favelas in Brazil, or like with Kowloon in the past in Hong Kong, people just start to self-regulate and build their own communities because the state has completely failed them. Now, Kowloon was an interesting case in that because of the various different governments of Hong Kong and disputed territory with the British and the Chinese, it just was somewhere caught in the middle that constantly just ignored rules and constantly had plans for demolition or different governments' control, and it just somehow like skipped them. But this is what happened to it eventually. In the subsequent decades, the population of the walled city boomed, but so did concerns and conflicts within the community without most of the rules, regulations, and services and infrastructures that maintain the day-to-day activities in the vast majority of cities. In the chaos of Kowloon, there were no taxes and business and sanitation standards, not to mention the lack of licensed healthcare providers and police. Soon, the traditional triad gangs found footholds in the walled city, which became a centerpiece for the Hong Kong narcotics trade. Prostitution flourished and unlicensed doctors and dentists proliferated, as did restaurants and food stalls, shops and family factories. The city's water and power supplies were inadequate and unsafe, and in the late 1980s, the community was served by only one postman and 2 elevators. The latter was problematic considering that the city had grown vertically, stacking tiny living spaces on top of each other. Conditions continued to deteriorate, and eventually in 1987, residents and business owners were quietly compensated to leave the walled city to a total tune of $2.76 billion by the Hong Kong authorities. By the end of 1991, only a few hundred residents remained, and riot police forcibly evicted anyone who refused to leave, with a wrecking ball beginning the destruction in 1993. So although people like William Gibson obviously thought of this as cool, and it is very interesting to people, I'll admit that is an interesting thing to think of, because especially in urban environments, we're so controlled by the state. The UK is obviously famous for having like the most CCTV cameras anywhere in the world. If you go up London, of course, in any capital city, Hanoi as well, you feel the state's presence, you see the police, you see a lot of law enforcement just going around. And the thought of going to somewhere in London and living somewhere which doesn't adhere to the rules of society, I can see how that might be attractive to people and how people might grow to like that. But as I said with my own experience living in a quite cramped conditions, it's just so unsafe. And Kowloon did become like really unsafe. Of course, a hotbed for organized crime as well. But that's where this eventually leads you, because what are these people meant to do? You can't rely on the state, so you have to rely on each other, and you're just gonna find somewhere to build a home and build it. And again, that's what happened with the favelas starting in the 1960s in Brazil. And it's a very similar thing to the Kowloon walled city. And this is what it breeds. And although you can see the positive sides with the sense of community, at the end of the day, just leaving people to fend for themselves when you have a responsibility as a government to care for them is not the desired outcome of living in any society. But under capitalism, favelas and walled cities are tolerated. Now, we're talking about Brazil, we're talking about Hong Kong. Could this ever happen in the West? Now, like I said, there are certain like estates and tower block communities which do have some of that feel, but at the same time, these houses are still kind of used with their intended purpose in that it's mainly, you know, the apartment still functions as it was designed to. It's like one family for one apartment, right? But I saw this video the other day and I couldn't really believe it, to be honest. And it was on a channel, and I hope he lets me use this so I can show you some of it, called Eric Van Conover. Don't know anything about him, but it was called Living in a Tiny Apartment for like $600 in New York. And again, New York is worse than Hong Kong apparently for a lot of this stuff. So I just want to show you a tiny bit of it.
So this is the cheapest apartment in all of Manhattan.
Welcome to my walk-in closet. To the walk-in closet.
Everyone's seen the video before, and to see it, it's smaller in real life than on the video.
So I have the couch all the way to the wall. You can maximize as much living room space as possible.
Living room couch actually turns into a bed, so you technically could have friends from out of town visit you if you wanted to, and you still have enough room to even open the refrigerator with the bed down.
Do you cook here?
Not a lot, but anytime I do, I have to store all plates and everything underneath here.
So across we have 82 inches.
110.
110?
That's literally a parking spot.
I was curious the ceiling height because in the video I saw, I was like, oh wow, this is pretty low, but it's not that low. 6'8" ceiling height down here. This is okay, this is a lot smaller than I thought it was. 1 foot 10 inches of head clearance up here.
Talk about the water leaking. The ceiling literally was caving in up here.
Oh wow.
And I don't know, I guess just so much rain. So I had to call the maintenance guy, and I actually used tape all night, and I taped this little hole right here. And I woke up because water was dripping on me.
$650 per month times 12. So that's $7,800 per year just for this place.
Yes.
So watching that, could I live in that apartment for like a month? I think I could. I've lived in a couple small studio apartments with my girlfriend for a month each, and you know, we found it fine, right? But that really only works if you're pretty minimalistic, as I was when I was traveling, and don't have many possessions. But even then, it can still get to you being in that small space, and that bed especially, not liking that at all, just being that close to the ceiling. But again, that is $650 a month. America geographically is a bit luckier in that, unlike a place like London, most of the jobs are probably not in New York. I'm sure like a lot of them are, but because you have a fair few like massive cities, not everyone has to go live in like these tiny apartments in New York because that's where the work is and you can't afford anything else. But in countries where you do have that like north-south divide, like London, or you have that south-north divide, like Italy, for example, where most of the poverty is in the south, so people move like north, kind of happens in Spain as well, then you have people increasingly moving to just a few locations just to find work. And that is a very common thing that happens in the UK with people who get out of university, like where are all the jobs? They are making an effort to make places like Manchester more of a hub for these types of career jobs, but it has always been London, and London's population has just kept increasing throughout my lifetime, and with that as well, loads more people coming here, no rent control while wages stagnate, so you increasingly having people spending so much more of their income just on a place to live, and they know if you leave or have a problem with it, there will be someone who will pay that money. And in other videos you've probably seen increasingly in London, there's been people just selling out closets as like a bedroom and charging like £1,000 a month, right? And it's just insane to any normal person that this should be allowed. This should be legal, and landlords should be able to get away with this. But in a capitalist system, the interest of capital will always trump the interest of just your average human being. So because so many people in the government are landlords, what is the incentive to say to people, You can't own more than 2 properties. You cannot increase your rent by, I don't know, more than 1% per year or something like that. Where are these laws? New Labour National Socialist government, where are these laws for us? Oh wait, you don't care about this either. So although we aren't at Hong Kong levels yet, London could one day be like Hong Kong, especially considering how much this country has suffered under Tory austerity. So these small homes have always existed, but if you type in Coffin Homes and type in random countries, you'll see it's becoming an increasing trend, and across the Western world, just rent is going insane for most people, and homes qualities are deteriorating, and the state is increasingly not providing public housing. And that's another big thing in the UK. When my parents were born and growing up, I think like 80% of the country had public housing. And Margaret Thatcher basically privatised that as well and sold them all off. So basically no one has public housing anymore. And it's just going to take so long to address that. And then you just have to rely on successive governments actually prioritising this, which if Labour only lasts 5 years, then that's not even going to be a thing. Not that they've promised that too much anyway. So it's just like a bleak situation at the moment. And the one thing to remember is you read me talking about the Coffin Homes and people like that janitor, you're far closer to being that guy than you are to being some millionaire, right? And that's what you always have to remember when you read stories like that or hear me say that and think, well, that's not going to be me. That's not going to be me because I'm too smart. I make too much money. You're still at the mercy of capitalism and you're not in control of this economic system at all. You are exploited by it. And because of that, it's always going to be a gun over your head. It's always going to be something in the background waiting to strike. And it doesn't take much to reduce you and get you right back down to the bottom, no matter how hard you've worked, no matter if you own even your own home, right? And increasingly, less of us do, which makes us even more of a prisoner because we are at the mercy of landlords, of bosses, of CEOs, and we have no autonomy or freedom under capitalism. And also you should remember this is a communist channel and I'm not going to praise Joe Biden. Weird people in the last video who were getting mad that I criticised him. But that is it for the video. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments, and if you made it this far, thank you for watching.